The Battle of Jutland was fought on May 31st, 1916 between the fleets of the British and German empires. It was the last battle between massed lines of battleships in history and marked a significant moment in the course of the First World War. For the 2 years preceding Jutland, the German High Seas Fleet under Vice Admiral Reinhard Scheer had largely been confined to port by the numerically superior Grand Fleet of the Royal Navy, led by Admiral Sir John Jellicoe. Having taken over command of the fleet in January, Scheer was keen to try and win a significant victory using it, of the kind that might ease the crippling blockade on Germany. The premise for such a victory was fairly simple. Scheer would attempt to lure just part of the Grand Fleet into battle by itself and destroy it before Jellicoe could bring his huge main fleet into action. This part was to be Vice Admiral Sir David Beattie's fleet of 6 battlecruisers and 4 brand new Queen Elizabeth class Dreadnoughts, which was based at Rosyth to react quickly to German raids across the North Sea. By using his own battlecruiser force under Rear Admiral Franz Hipper to raid British shipping, Scheer hoped to provoke Beattie into charging across the North Sea without regard for his own safety. Once engaged, Hipper's ships would turn and draw Beattie towards the waiting High Seas Fleet, destroying a major component of the British fleet before Jellicoe could react to events. In the early hours of the last day of May 1916, Scheer's plan was put into effect. The first scouting group, Hipper's force, steamed out of Wilhelmshaven, followed a few hours later by Scheer's main fleet of 16 dreadnoughts and 6 pre-dreadnoughts, escorted by cruisers and destroyers. Unknown to the Germans though, by the time their ships were underway, the entire British Grand Fleet was already at sea. The previous day, the Admiralty intercepted and decoded Scheer's signal ordering his plan to be put into action, and the Grand Fleet left Scapa Flow at 9:30 PM, May 30th. Jellicoe had 27 dreadnoughts plus the 3 battlecruisers of Rear Admiral Horace Hood's 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron. From Rosyth, Beattie steamed west at high speed. Not knowing exactly what the Germans were up to, Jellicoe ordered Beattie to steam to a point 100 miles northwest of the Horn's Reef, whereupon if no enemy ships were sighted he was to turn north and unite with the Grand Fleet. Just before 1 PM on May 31st, Jellicoe received what appeared to be useful information. The Admiralty informed him that Scheer's call sign was still transmitting from Wilhelmshaven, giving the impression that he was not at sea. This information was false, the result of a miscommunication between staff at the Admiralty. When Jellicoe eventually found the German fleet at sea, his faith in the Admiralty's information was shaken. A few dozen miles to the south of Jellicoe, Beattie reached his waypoint just after 2 PM. At 2:10, seeing no sign of the enemy, he signalled his squadron to turn north. Just minutes later, a signal arrived from the cruiser HMS Galatea, announcing that she had spotted and was moving to engage 2 German destroyers. Beattie wasted little time, swinging his ship around at 2:32 without even waiting for the rest of his ships to acknowledge his order. The other battlecruisers followed Beattie's flagship Lion, but Rear Admiral Hugh Evan Thomas, who was commanding the dreadnoughts 5 miles astern, could not see the flag signal clearly, did not. He remained steaming northwest for 7 long minutes until the signal was eventually repeated by searchlight, causing his squadron to fall 10 miles behind Beattie. At 2:39, as Evan Thomas was finally turning south, Galatea signalled both Beattie and Jellicoe again, reporting the presence of multiple vessels larger than cruisers. It could only be Hipper. Almost an hour later, the 2 battlecruiser forces engaged after Hipper reversed course back towards Scheer, with the British hot on his heels. In the initial exchanges, German gunnery was much better than the British. Several British salvos sailed miles over the German line as imprecise British rangefinders were compounded by the poor visibility facing east and by a westerly wind blowing smoke from British guns back between them and the enemy ships. Beattie's squadron also made a mistake in targeting. Princess Royal correctly joined Lion in firing at Hipper's flagship Lutzow, but Queen Mary mistakenly targeted her numerical opposite number Seydlitz and not the second German ship as she had been ordered. This left Derfflinger untroubled by shell fire for the first 10 minutes of the battle. Shortly after 4 PM, the rearmost British battlecruiser, Indefatigable, took a bad hit from Von der Tann, which penetrated a turret and ignited powder charges which had been stacked close to the guns. The flash flyer resulting travelled down to the magazine, the doors of which were open, and detonated it. In a catastrophic explosion, the ship was ripped apart. Of 1,017 men in Indefatigable's crew, only 2 would survive to be plucked from the sea. Reeling from this loss, Beattie was lucky that Evan Thomas was now coming into range of the German squadron. One of the most accurate shooting formations in the Royal Navy, the 5th Battle Squadron soon landed blows on Von der Tann. destroying 2 of her turrets and forcing her and Moltke to zigzag. The battle now looked to be going the way of the British, but at 4:26 tragedy struck again. After a fearsome barrage from Derfflinger and Seydlitz, Queen Mary suffered the same fate as Indefatigable, being ripped apart by an enormous magazine explosion. Tiger, just 500 yards behind Queen Mary, turned hard to swerve around, with her decks being showered by debris from the stricken battlecruiser. In just 2 minutes, Queen Mary had gone, taking 1,266 crew with her. Now 2 ships down, Beatty turned to Lyon's captain and remarked famously, "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today." Unknown to the British Vice Admiral, his situation was about to get even more perilous. Several miles to the southeast, Commodore William Goodenough was leading a cruiser squadron south, trying to get between Hipper and his route home. At 4:38 PM, Goodenough stumbled across the entire German High Seas fleet and signalled Beatty and Jellicoe to inform them. 5 minutes later, Beatty's ships were turned 180 degrees around to steam north. It was a retreat, but Beatty also hoped he could now draw Hipper and Scheer towards the Grand Fleet, which the Germans did not yet know was at sea. After a brief time where Evan Thomas continued to travel south after Beatty had turned northwards, the battleships eventually placed themselves between Beatty and the German fleet, taking the brunt of the incoming fire. For the next hour, the British sped north with Hipper and the leading German Dreadnought in hot pursuit, believing the British to be fleeing. At 5:25, Beatty emerged from behind Evan Thomas and surged northeast, cutting across Hipper's bows. Unwilling to allow Beatty to cross his T, a position that would enable all of Beatty's guns to fire against only Hipper's forward armament, the Germans turned east, bending the vanguard of the High Seas fleet out of shape. 20 minutes later, Beatty spotted the Grand Fleet's cruiser vanguard and pressed further east, trying to keep Hipper from seeing Jellicoe's arrival for as long as possible. The 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron under Horace Hood now entered the fray, engaging the 2nd Scouting Group to Hipper's east and disabling the light cruiser Wiesbaden. The reports of British dreadnoughts in this direction alerted the German admiral to the presence of someone other than Beatty, but by now it was too late. At 6:13 PM, Beatty was able to relay the position of the German fleet to Jellicoe, while Scheer, 13 ships back in the German line, still had no idea what was going on up ahead. With the High Seas fleet not far away, Jellicoe now had to deploy the fleet from its cruising formation of 6 columns of 4 ships into a battle line. After some deliberation, it was decided to turn to port to do this, which would position the fleet against the dark eastern sky and make it harder for the Germans to aim at them. At 6:15, the order was given and 27 dreadnoughts began to turn to port, each division of 4 ships slotting in behind the one on its port side. Around them, dozens of cruisers and destroyers scrambled for space, and remarkably there was not one collision anywhere along the 6-mile-long line, though the armoured cruiser Defence was sunk during a headlong charge towards the disabled cruiser Wiesbaden. There was further bad news for the British when Warspite took a hit to her rudder, disabling it and forcing her to steam around in a circle in front of the High Seas fleet. Hit 13 times, she was eventually brought under control and sent back to Britain. Further east, Horace Hood swung his battlecruisers to the front of the fleet whilst Beatty steamed to slot in behind. HMS Invincible was now the lead ship of the Grand Fleet and shot extremely well, hitting Lutzow 8 times in as many minutes and turning that ship into essentially a floating wreck. At 6:29 though, after a nasty hit from Derfflinger, she became the 3rd British ship to suffer a huge magazine detonation. All but 6 of her 1,031 crew were killed, including Hood. Meanwhile, by this time the German fleet was in a terrible position. Lutzow was forced to disengage and return home, and the entire fleet had now had its T crossed by the British. Its vanguard was taking a hammering, and at 6:36 Scheer ordered a retreat, with every ship in the line turning to starboard simultaneously. Within minutes, they had vanished into the mist. Then inexplicably at 6:55 Scheer turned his fleet about once again and steamed directly back at the Grand Fleet, which by now was barely visible against the darkening sky. Under a torrent of fire, the German line buckled, with ships at the front bunching up so badly that they began to turn away on their own initiative. At 7:13 Scheer ordered a retreat once again, but this time it was complete chaos, with ships turning in both directions, desperate to get out from underneath British fire. To cover the retreat, the 1st Scouting Group charged valiantly forth into what was the most powerful concentration of naval gunfire ever seen in history. In a devastating hail of steel, Derfflinger was hit 14 times in 4 minutes, but remarkably remained afloat. After this short charge, the battlecruisers were pulled back, with destroyers pushed forwards in a mass torpedo attack. forcing Jellicoe to turn away to minimise the chances of damage to his ships. Sunset over the North Sea arrived at 8:30 PM, and it was now time for Scheer to try and escape. He knew that he couldn't hope to defeat the Grand Fleet from this position, and that if his ships were still exposed at dawn, they would be ripped apart by Jellicoe's fleet. He had to escape, either by steaming south or towards the Horn's Reef and then south into Wilhelmshaven. Knowing that the faster British ships might be able to cut him off if he went south, Scheer decided to head for the Horn's Reef, slipping behind or if need be cutting straight through the British fleet. Jellicoe steamed south with a screen of 57 destroyers trailing behind to keep an eye out for the Germans. Just before 10 PM, Jellicoe received more information from the Admiralty, this time informing him that the German battle fleet was 10 miles southwest of his flagship, something that Jellicoe knew could not possibly be true given the two fleets' relative speeds. This second round of false information put severe doubt about the Admiralty's intelligence into Jellicoe's head, so that when he was told at 10:40, correctly this time, that the German fleet was heading to the Horn's Reef, he did not believe them. Further decoded messages which indicated Scheer's course were not passed on to Jellicoe at all. He was essentially blind. At 11:20 PM, the High Seas Fleet began to cut into the destroyer screen trailing behind the Grand Fleet. Over the next few hours, it cut a swathe through the 4th and 12th destroyer flotillas, sinking 4 and heavily damaging many more. The pre-Dreadnought Pommern was lost to British torpedoes, while the destroyer Spitfire rammed the Dreadnought Nassau. By 2 AM, the Germans had reached the Horn's Reef and safety. Incredibly, despite multiple British dreadnoughts seeing the battles taking place and seeing German dreadnoughts close to them, none had thought to let Jellicoe know what was going on and let alone open fire. Throughout the battle, the flow of information back to the Commander-in-Chief had been woefully inadequate. To illustrate this, it wasn't until the following day that Jellicoe even knew that Indefatigable and Queen Mary had been sunk at all. BT simply hadn't told him. The Battle of Jutland was costly to both sides. The British lost 3 battlecruisers, 3 armoured cruisers and 8 destroyers and 6,768 men. Germany lost 1 battlecruiser, the Lutzow, which had to be abandoned in the end, 1 pre-dreadnought, 4 light cruisers and 5 destroyers, and 3,058 men. In addition, many of Germany's ships were severely damaged and would require many weeks in dry dock, whereas the British main battle line was relatively lightly damaged. Only Marlborough and Warspite had sustained real damage. A detailed analysis of Jutland is a story for another time, but we can say here that it was strategically a British victory. Whereas Scheer was left with just 10 operational dreadnoughts and reported that he couldn't go to sea until August, Jellicoe reported at 9 PM on June 2nd, just 2 days after the battle, that he could sail once again with 4 hours notice, with 24 dreadnoughts. When the two fleets did briefly sortie in August 1916, the British numbered 28 dreadnoughts to the Germans 15. Scheer soon returned to port. British naval supremacy was intact. As a New York News report put it, the German fleet has assaulted its jailer, but it is still in jail. A big thank you to World of Warships for reaching out to sponsor this video. As I said earlier on, World of Warships is a free-to-play game where you can command some of history's most iconic ships, including many that took part in the Battle of Jutland featured today. Each of these is rendered in game with a brilliant attention to detail, making each ship look as realistic as possible. As someone who has played over 1,000 games of World of Warships, I can highly recommend it as a blend of both action and strategic gameplay that is a lot of fun with friends. To sign up and also support this channel, use the link in the description below and the code PLAYWARSHIPS2018 to receive 250 premium doubloons, 1,000,000 credits, 3 days of premium time and the premium HMS Campbelltown Tier 3 destroyer. Thanks again to World of Warships for sponsoring this video. A big thank you is also due to my patrons, whose names you can see on the screen right now. As always, I simply wouldn't be here doing YouTube if not for their support, and I'm eternally grateful for them. Thank you all very much for watching, have a nice Christmas, and I will see you in the new year, where Historigraph will be kicking off 2019 with probably the most famous amphibious landing in history. See you then.